Oh, hi, I'm Mark. I've been a professional artist for 85 years and now I teach art for a living. In this week's episode of my weekly series for artists I call YouTube Art School, I'll show typical mistakes artists make when coloring their art. Mistakes you might be making as well. Of course, even more importantly, I'll try to show you how to fix those mistakes and get awesome results. Quickly, let's get this class started. Alright, class is in session. Pay attention. Coloring is hard. Whether it's choosing harmonious colors for your character's outfit, or what hues to pick to make sure your original character's skin isn't all dead looking, or choosing an aesthetic color palette for your painting, or how to tint your shadows. As a teacher, I see the mistakes that we'll highlight in today's class all the time. What's cool though, get it? Cool as in cool color. Anyways, what's cool is that they're fairly easy mistakes to avoid once you're aware that you're making them. And we'll look at 5 of the biggest mistakes. All right, time to get those art XP points after you've paid the class fee of either 1 like or 1 sub. That's better. All right, let's get to it. Now, the first mistake is probably the most common. Shading with black. In this example here, I have nice-ish shading from light to dark, but this is a result that you almost always see when beginners start to dabble with colors. The problem is there's no richness to those colors. If you look at the color box on the right here, you can see the values go up and down as I color pick on the different parts of the gradient, but the hue and the saturation don't change. This usually happens when you just add black to your base color to come up with a darker version of that color. The result is boring. It's not exciting. It's basic. Instead, I always recommend using different colors for the shadows and the highlights. I'll show you a trick that works in almost every scenario. Starting with whatever color you consider your shadow color, drag the color picker to the top right or saturate and lighten the color. Then drag the hue slider down towards yellow just a little bit. We get a much more vibrant and rich result, especially when the entire character is treated this way. It makes more sense technically speaking too. Light is what brings out the saturation in colors. When it's sunny outside, everything always looks more saturated compared to like an overcast day, for example, or a night scene. It's the presence of light that gives surfaces their perceived colors. See how the color now moves from a less saturated area to a more saturated area on the right, and also moves down here on the hue slider. And that's what we want. Moving on, the second mistake is also very common. It's to ignore color hierarchy. I think most artists are aware of at least the fact that not all colors are equal. Some colors are more exciting to the eyes than others. Gray, for example, is not exciting. It's as boring as it gets. Red, on the other hand, is a much more exciting color. It's actually the most visually exciting color there is. If we were to think of colors as magnets for our eyes, pure red would be the strongest magnet. It commands attention. What's maybe not as obvious is how you can use this logic to your advantage when coloring, or how it can ruin your coloring if used badly. If we look at the main difference here between gray and red, it's the level of saturation, right? If we desaturate the red, it becomes just as boring as the other gray we had, and now it's no longer a strong visual magnet. So when we talk about color hierarchy, saturation is really the main characteristic of colors that you should focus on. Ignoring color hierarchy then usually results in attracting the attention of the viewer to parts of the drawing or the painting that are not important. Let's say you have a character concept like this. You might be really happy with your design, but then you use a super saturated background. Meanwhile, the character itself is, relatively desaturated. And what happens is our eyes simply get attracted to the strongest visual magnets, and the result is most people will look at this and see the background first, or be continuously distracted by it. We can't help ourselves. It doesn't need to be red even. Any saturated color will have a similar effect. Obviously, normally that's not what we want. We want all the attention on the character, and we want the background to just be there as support to help feature the design, right? Saturate what is important, desaturate what isn't. This applies to almost everything, even when you don't have a background. Take this other character here. On the right version, the saturation is adjusted to be a little stronger around the focal point of the drawing, or the face of the character. On the left version, the focus shifts to the boots since that's where the saturation is. Always keep color hierarchy in mind. It's one of our main tools to control where the attention of the viewer goes. It's power! Now, I'm covering this really fast because we don't have a whole lot of time in a short YouTube video to go super in depth with this stuff, but I cover cover art theory in great detail in my art program if that's something that you're trying to seriously level up, along with a ton of other topics. Art School for Digital Artists is a complete art education program from home. Check out the coupon in the video description to save a big chunk off of the total until the end of the month. There's still some time left. We're celebrating reaching past 10,000 students. If you're one of them, you're awesome. I love you. Alright, now, the third typical mistake artists make while coloring is having bad color balance. It's completely different in color hierarchy. When I say color balance, I mean the balance between warm and cool colors. Poor color balance means having an overwhelming ratio of cool or warm colors. This here, for example, is too warm. It's suffocating. There are basically no cool colors in this painting. But if we add some, all of a sudden our balance comes back and it's a lot more pleasant to look at. The same applies the other way around. This example here is too cool in a bad way. There's no contrast, no balance. It's too one-sided. Adding a bit of warmth to the color palette makes a huge difference. Don't you agree? Of course you agree. Now, one thing to keep in mind when dealing with color temperature is that warm colors tend to be more visually dominant and cool colors tend to recede in the background. There are always exceptions, but it's a good general rule to keep in mind. Warm colors are more appealing in general, so I always recommend using them for your focal point or to help bring attention to something. Cool colors are often good as secondary colors, like background colors or shadow colors. Having good balance between your cool and warm colors always looks more aesthetic. Pay attention to it. Often when your painting or drawing is lacking something, it'll be due to that balance being off. Give it a shot. The fourth mistake is not using color harmonies. Unless you're very knowledgeable about colors, I always recommend artists use common harmonies like complementary color harmonies, where you'll use two colors opposite on the chromatic circle, one with more saturation than the other. On the left here, I have a character not using any particular color harmony. It looks kind of messy, right? Meanwhile, on the right, we have a complementary color palette like I was just referring to. Everything reads much better. It's just a more visually pleasing color combination. Another color harmony that I like using is triads. 3 colors with equal distance between themselves on the chromatic circle. One of those combinations you've seen many times before, I'm sure, is the blue, yellow, and red triad. It's used a lot. Once again, you'll want to use one of those 3 colors as the dominant color by making it brighter and more saturated than the other 2. Color harmonies are recipes. If you don't know what you're doing, just like if you're trying to bake a cake for the first time, you find a recipe, right? It's the same with coloring. Use trusted recipes first, and with experience, you'll be able to deviate from that and explore different combinations. Color harmonies are known to be colors that pair well together, creating aesthetic results, so when in doubt, use them. I still use them all the time. Finally, the last mistake is to ignore the impact of the Terminator. What? No, not this guy. The Terminator in color theory is the zone of transition between the highlights and the shadows. How is that relevant to coloring, you ask? Well, ignoring it will often result in dead-looking skin for your characters. Its effect is not only limited to the color of skin, but it certainly impacts it a lot. If the skin you paint tends to look muddy, dead-looking, the Terminator is usually the problem. If we take a simple gradient like this, we understand its skin based on the context, but adding more saturation and a warm tint to the Terminator will make this skin look way more alive, way more convincing, right? It makes a huge difference. You can also use that trick for any surface, not just skin. Here I have a basic highlight on the armor, but if I were to tint the Terminator with a little bit more yellow, only for the transition between the light and the shadow, I get a much richer result. That looks good. Of course, just make sure the values remain the same, right? We don't want the Terminator to be too bright or too dark, just in between the values for the highlight and the shadow. Tint your Terminators and avoid all the other mistakes we covered today too. If you do, just like magic, your coloring should look a lot better. Except it's not magic, it's color theory. Anyways, that's going to wrap it up for this week's class. Let me know in the comments if it helped and if you have any requests for future classes. Also, since you made it until the end like a good student, you can go ahead and download one of my 2 main brush sets for free if you haven't already. It's full of brushes that I use all the time. Don't think the fact that it's free means they're not good. They're my daily brushes. I love them. And I love you too. See you next week. Whoa.